On behalf of the Steering Committee of Upper Hudson Peace Action, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, a talk by Sovaida Ma'ani Ewing on the role that strengthened global governance can play in creating a peaceful world. Upper Hudson Peace Action is one of nearly 24 community and campus chapters all across the state of New York. It is affiliated with Peace Action of New York State and National Peace Action, the largest membership peace organization in the United States. Upper Hudson Peace Action works to reduce military spending, secure nuclear disarmament, defend Palestinian rights, and overall to prevent and end the long nightmare of war. We sponsor meetings, vigils, rallies, films, and other forms of public education, and also lobby public officials for these purposes. During tonight's event, the audience will be muted and should stay muted, but you will be able to place your questions for our speaker in the chat feature. When you do so, please place a question mark before your question itself. After her talk is completed, a member of the Upper Hudson Peace Action Steering Committee will direct as many of these questions as possible to the speaker in the time remaining. If you are planning to submit a question, please do so at the end of her talk, as questions flashing on the screen during the talk are distracting, and also her full talk might deal with the issue that you raise. Before introducing Sovaida Ma'ani Ewing, though, I'm going to turn over the floor briefly to Sally Jones, the chair of the Peace Action Fund of New York State. Sally?
Oh, thank you, Larry. Just a second. My name is Sally Jones. I'm with Peace Action New York State. We are an affiliate of National Peace Action. And the state affiliate was created in the 1990s when the upstate chapters and the downstate chapters got together. And right now we have 8 chapters all across New York State and 4 affiliated allies. And we also do a student organizing program. We have 15 campus chapters. So this is something we're very proud of, and we're work closely with National Peace Action to work on issues of resolving conflict and educating public about the issues around peace and war. So thank you, Larry, for giving me a chance to talk about this organization that I love.
Okay, thank you, Sally. We're pleased to be co-sponsoring this talk tonight, titled, "It's Time to Build a Supranational System of Governance, an Indispensable Foundation for Peace," by Sovaida Ma'ani Ewing. Sovaida, who was born in Kenya and has lived in numerous nations, has a Master of Laws degree and has practiced law, especially international law, for 2 decades. She's the founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, a virtual think tank, an online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. Additionally, she hosts a live video podcast, Reimagining Our World, and has written 5 books on peace and global governance issues, the latest of which is titled The Alchemy of Peace. In the past, she served on the board of the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Currently, she is a board member of the Citizens for Global Solutions Education Fund, which is where I became acquainted with her and her work. Over the years, I've noticed that members of the U.S. peace movement are often caught up in immediate crisis situations, and as a result, sometimes fail to look beyond these crises at the deeper factors that lead to international conflicts and at the deeper solutions that might be drawn upon to address them. And so I look forward to tonight's talk, which I think will provide us with some creative thinking about coping more successfully with the problem of war. So, Sovaida, take it away.
Okay, thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here with all of you and to meet a whole new cohort of fellow peace activists. I'm going to share my screen now. It's one of the joys of the Zoom world. I normally, when I'm speaking, don't like to have notes in front of me, but here goes. That way, we'll make sure that you all stay awake and that you can follow along more easily. Although I've never yet put anyone to sleep, so okay. Hopefully you can see it. All right, the title for this evening is It's Time to Build a Supranational System of Governance and Indispensable Foundation for Peace. There comes a time in all our lives when we have to stop and take stock of where we are, make sure we're heading in the right direction in life. This is true for our individual lives and our collective lives. And make sure that we know what destination we're heading to so that we can arrive there and not be surprised when we get to a destination we don't want to be at. As a global community, we're really long overdue for this stock taking. It's time for a clear-eyed assessment of the choices we've made that have gotten us to where we are today. So if we don't like where we are, we can just, again, as I said, engage in this clear-eyed assessment, say, okay, here are the choices that got us here. What can we do to change it? What different choices can we make going forward? This is a really important fact, so I'm going to just hammer it home one more time. We are not consigned to repeat our past. At every moment in our existence as a collective unit, we can make new, more empowering and constructive choices. And knowing that we have a choice is very liberating, empowering, and motivating in and of itself. But in order to create better choices, we need to first have a vision of where we want to end up, and then look at where we are, and then determine the steps that we need to take to bridge the gap between where we are and where we want to be. And this is really the purpose of this talk, is to propose some practical, politically palatable, and high impact steps we can take to get from here to a better world, a more peaceful, secure world. That's really what our common goal is. So where are we right now? Our world is being buffeted by crises on every side. Humanity is hurtling over in the direction of a cliff top. Over, if you imagine a high-speed train, that it feels like that's what we are. And we're just mindlessly increasing our speed and accelerating as we approach the edge of this cliff. We've got to change course if we want to not suffer inordinately. We're already suffering. Many people in many parts of the world are suffering inordinately for a variety of reasons. Many of our global crises are existential, and many of them are collective. So we have climate change, which is the slow-moving, horrible storm. If we thought COVID was bad, climate change is, COVID times a million, essentially. Climate change leads to food insecurity, water insecurity, energy insecurity, and so many other things, floods, droughts, wildfires, displacement of people, and political conflict. Another existential crisis is the threat of nuclear war that we thought we had put behind us, but the conflict in Ukraine has demonstrated that it's once again a very real specter. And there are actually a lot of potential powder kegs for a nuclear war around the world that could result from either deliberate or accidental use of weapons that have proliferated contrary to international law. And the third is the devastating conflicts, like the conflicts in Ukraine or in Tigray or in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or in Yemen or Syria or Myanmar. I mean, just keep going, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, on and on and on. Really, every corner of the world you look at, you see this. So we really, I believe, when I look at the world, I see that our options as a collective whole are twofold. We either unify and become more integrated, or we self-destruct. But if we're going to take steps to unify and stop ourselves from self-destructing, we first have to create some essential shifts in our mindsets, which require reading the reality of the social reality of our collective life correctly, and shedding a set of false assumptions and limiting beliefs that we've just mindlessly bought into and that are driving us like the operating system of a computer that we don't think about when we use a computer. Larry and I were just talking about challenges using computers. And none of us, at least Larry and I, aren't familiar with software coding. And so we don't really understand who coded what and how in order for this Zoom piece of software, for instance, to do what it's doing. We're just at the mercy of what it does. And the same is true for our individual and collective lives. So it's really important to identify what these underlying drivers are, bring them to the light of consciousness so that we can choose which ones serve us and which don't. The first mindset shift involves recognizing that humanity as a whole, the history of humanity, is one of evolution, an evolution that is marked by ever-widening circles of integration. We started with owing our loyalty, primary loyalty, to the family, then it went to the clan, the city-state, the nation, and then we kind of got stuck there. The next inevitable stage in our global societal development is when we get to the point where we recognize that we need to owe our primary allegiance to the globe, to humanity as a whole. So I've got on this slide, buckle up, humanity is now navigating a turbulent adolescence. It explains a lot of our bad behavior. We've come up with a lot of stories that we tell ourselves that I think are very disempowering stories, like, oh, human beings are just evil by nature. We're always going to engage in conflict. Nothing's ever going to change. Well, gosh, if you really think that, we might as well just shoot ourselves and die now, because there is no hope, right? If we're never going to change and we're sinful and bad and prone to aggression, then what's the point in us even sitting here having this conversation? So it's kind of like our kids when they're at home. As parents, we don't give up on them when they're going through their teenage years, because we recognize that this is just a phase. They're acting out, and we, in fact, exercise more love, more patience, more compassion, and a lot more firm guidance, knowing and trusting that they will get over this phase and enter the stage of maturity. So the same is true of us as a human race. All right, so when we understand this, we understand also that we need to jettison the old stuff that, if you like, is sinking the ship of humanity. So old childish behaviors that no longer serve us, we need to let go of. And that means being courageous enough to recognize that there's certain laws, institutions, policies, ways of doing things, ways of organizing ourselves societally and internationally that no longer serve our well-being and happiness. And that these things, laws, institutions, policies, are really there to serve our interests, not for us to sacrifice ourselves to maintain them at whatever cost. We see this in various societies. We see this in our country here in the United States, where in the name of preserving like a particular thing that, say, the framers of a constitution from a couple of hundred years ago put in the name of saving that, we're willing to sacrifice thousands of lives and well-being just to uphold those. So we really need to stop and think about what it is we're doing, just generally. So it's time as humanity to develop new tools and capabilities, and we'll come to that in a second. first I want to examine the second, a mindset shift. Okay, I see this. I've got this quote from Albert Einstein here, which I love, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. This is all part of the really examining what we've been doing so far and then doing something different. Okay. Second mindset shift is to recognize the reality that the world is so interdependent and interconnected in an unprecedented fashion that humanity has become like a single organism. So think of the human body. The human body is a single organism, and yet each of the organs and limbs has its own function that it plays and differs from the other. But we don't say, oh gosh, the kidneys are different from the liver. How terrible. Let's either discriminate against the kidneys or let's make them feel like they're less than the liver. And it would certainly be nonsensical for the liver to say to the kidneys, I don't care if you're diseased or you're cancer ridden, I'm out for number one. And yet we live in a world that's interconnected where one country happily will say to another country, well, we're more important than you. So, hey, we don't care that you're having problems. If we had any doubt that humanity has become this single organism, we just have to look at the war in Ukraine. I think it's, COVID should have done the trick. It should have demonstrated to us our oneness and our interconnectedness. But some of us learned it, but there's a lot of learning still to happen. Then came the war in Ukraine. And what's fascinating to me is that it triggered this regional war, this war that normally we would have said, oh gosh, it's their problem, let them deal with it, has triggered a global energy crisis, a global food crisis, a global economic crisis. It has brought about again the specter of a war that could be a global war and potentially a nuclear war. And I just want to remind us that when we talk about a nuclear war, even if it were to be a very limited one, either in duration or geographically, I want to remind us, and for those of us who don't know, to raise awareness about what the experts have discovered, that even if we were to have such a very short nuclear war, say half a day or a day or so, they did this study apropos of Pakistan and India, that it would result, in addition to the death and destruction and radiation and the mushroom clouds and so on, it would result in 10 years of no summer that would lead to crop failures around the world and would lead to 2 billion human beings threatened with starvation. 2 billion. And that's just from one tiny little nuclear, geographically or limited nuclear war. So these things are not glib, and we haven't even gotten to climate change and all the other things that are also brewing and looming. So it is time, as we said before, to jettison old behaviors and to replace them with a new one. Now, there is a reality that we have to face as we think about new things that we need to embrace. And that is the fact that just as there are laws that govern our physical lives, like the law of gravity, you and I can choose to ignore it because we have free will choice. I can say, hey, I don't believe there's such a thing as the law of gravity. I'm perfectly entitled to it. But I would be pretty foolish to try to build an airplane not taking into account the law of gravity. Similarly, in the social realm, there is a law, I believe, that is the law of oneness. And some would say in the spiritual realm too. Some people don't believe in the spiritual. So let's just talk about the social here. The law of oneness. It is a law that we need to respect, and yet we have blithely ignored it. And now we wonder why we see all our institutions, economic, political, environmental, etc., spectacularly failing us. It's like that airplane that is not flying because we failed to take into account the law of gravity / the law of oneness. So when we start to build new systems that are fit for this human race that is approaching the age of maturity, we need to start paying attention and taking into account the law of oneness. And I'm going to propose exactly how we might do this in a second. But first, let's go to the third mindset shift, the butterfly effect. if you look at what's happening in the world, you'll see that we are witnessing two simultaneous processes of integration and disintegration. Both are essential for us to transform and get to the next stage in our collective development, i.e. our maturity. And a really simple, good analogy is that of the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to the butterfly. As the caterpillar gorges and gorges itself and keeps shedding and molting its skin, eventually it cocoons itself. And what happens is that's the really interesting stage. Within the cocoon, even though we don't see it, two things are happening. On the one hand, the caterpillar is excreting these enzymes that are like acid, that are literally destroying its own body. So all the disintegration we see in the world today and the failure of all these systems and institutions can be likened to this caterpillar destroying itself. However, also not seen by the human eye is the fact that latent within the caterpillar have always been some sets of cells called imaginal discs. And they are the cells that correlate to the different parts of a new being, the new butterfly that will eventually emerge. And while this process of disintegration is going on in the cocoon, at the same time, these imaginal cells start to very rapidly multiply until they become the parts of the butterfly. And once the butterfly is fully formed and ready, it bursts forth from the cocoon. The process is very messy. If you were to poke a hole in the cocoon, it is icky and disgusting and smelly and gross. It's very similar to what's going on in our world today. It is disgusting and gross and painful, and people are suffering. And you look at the pictures of the death and destruction, and you look at the COVID rates of death, and you look at climate change and the droughts and the floods and the heat waves and on and on and on. Yes, it's messy. And yet I look here at you guys, all of us really. So you've got two peace activist groups just in one state in this wonderful nation that are working towards the process of integration, of building a new and better and more peaceful world. And this, you are these imaginal discs, and these imaginal discs need to proliferate and multiply rapidly. So this process of integration needs to be bolstered. The process of disintegration is spectacularly functioning of its own accord. It does not need any more help from us. But we do need to help the process of integration. And I think that's what we're here to do tonight. How do we build new tools and capacities and institutions and policies in which the three main themes are collaborate, cooperate, and consult? Very, it's nice that they're all three start with C's, so they're easy to remember. Now, when we bring together all the mindset shifts we look at, our maturation process, the existence and application of the law of oneness, and so on, in practice, what this means is that we need to recognize that this world that we're in has as its most severe problems that are global and collective in nature. Therefore, they demand collective solutions, and yet we lack precisely the collective decision-making and enforcement institutions we need to solve the problems like nuclear proliferation and climate change and global economic recession and global food crisis and so on. So it's time to bridge this chasm between our system of global governance as it exists, which is a very rudimentary and primitive form, and create the institutions fit for purpose to serve the needs and challenges of the 21st century and beyond. Now, a good example of the fact that we need this is we see this, I'm not going to go into this in detail because it's self-explanatory. You know, we look at how we're dealing with global warming, the craziness of having had 27 COP conferences where we still aren't at the point where we can come up with binding rules for each nation to cut back on its carbon emissions. And we're relying on voluntary pledges that even if all of them were met, which many of them are not being met, we would still be looking at the globe warming 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, as opposed to limiting it to 1.5 degrees. We look at war and conflict, we don't seem to be able to have solved it. Ukraine again, and all the wars in other places that we mentioned before. The global energy crisis that we've known for years was going to come, that we worried that one nation would hold others hostage when it came to energy. And here we are, we didn't do anything about it. The global food crisis, the global economic recession, and on and on. So our plight is really best summed up in the following analogy, which I love. There is a Singaporean diplomat, Kishore Mahbubani, who said that humanity used to be like 193 boats bobbing on the sea of international life, and our concern was just not to bump into each other. He said those times are long gone. We're now 193 cabins on a single ship. And while each cabin is beautifully functioning internally and has rules and crew to take care of the internal cabins, that has stewards, the ship as a whole lacks a captain and a crew. And this is what we've seen. We've seen this tangibly in the last 3 years. When COVID hit, there was nobody at the helm of the global ship to right it. We've seen this again with Ukraine, and we see this with the global economic recession, and so on. As Buckminster Fuller famously said, you never change things by, to move this, by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you need to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I'm going to now turn in a second to what that could look like, tangible, concrete proposal. It's going to require that we be willing to radically reconceptualize our understanding of society by starting to understand that all our interests as nations are actually fused, and that we need to stop playing this game, which is futile, of trying to maintain an equilibrium of competing interests. That's not worked. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. So definition of insanity, again, is to keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result. We ain't going to get a different result. So it's time to build a viable supranational system of global governance. So I'd like to propose that we do this in 2 steps. And interims, there's some interim steps that we can take, because things have to be politically palatable, and we need to be able to bring the people of the world along. If we want to take too big a leap at once, people get scared and we end up doing nothing. So we need to take some interim steps leading to an ultimate step, and I'm going to unpack what they are. Let's start with the first of 2 interim steps that I think we could begin to take today. The first is by building a supranational global authority to manage and/or own critical sources of energy and ensure their equitable distribution at reasonable prices. The goal here is really this. I think if we're to convince human beings that it is possible to have a supranational system of governance that works, we need to pick a narrow sector in which we begin, build something that's successful, demonstrate it's successful, build confidence, and then we can gradually build out. This was an idea that Jean Monnet, who was the father of the European Union as we know it today, came up with. And so I propose that the area we start with is energy, because by tackling the energy problem, we actually will be able to largely solve 3 of our major global challenges, what I call the triad of global challenges. The inequitable distribution of energy, which we're now, when I was writing about this 15 years ago, nobody was really thinking about this. The Ukraine war has really brought this home to us. That, wow, you know, we don't have, even European countries are seeing the price of energy go up 3, 4, 5, 6-fold almost overnight. People aren't able to pay their energy bills. And we also, let alone countries in a continent like Africa or Southeast Asia, where many people don't even have access to electricity or energy. So ensuring that all peoples everywhere have equitable access to energy on reasonable terms is a critical, really human right, I believe. The second is climate change. And the third is nuclear proliferation. These three problems are all interconnected. You can't solve one without tackling the others. So now, let's see. Let me quickly explain how the three are related to each other. If we are able to ensure that we have a global system where a certain supranational authority has the power to, it has the ability to see who is producing what amounts of energy and has the power to regulate the kinds of energy we can use, regulating the kind and quantity of energy will help us with global warming. So in other words, we stop burning fossil fuels, we move to renewable and clean energy. So we're dealing with the climate change problem. We know from experts that at least in the short term, at least the next few decades, we're going to need to have nuclear energy in the mix. The idea of having nuclear energy makes many people very nervous because we think not only about the health consequences and the safety consequences of nuclear energy, like we think about the Fukushima disaster, but we also think about it being, terrorists getting their hands and making dirty bombs. So again, pooling all sources of energy in the hands of a supranational agency where it's very transparent, where the whole world is aware of who's producing what, when, what the needs of everybody are, making sure everybody has equitable access. All of these are, and then creating a system, and we'll come to it in a second, of ensuring that this global, this supranational body also has the ability to regulate arms control. And that's the second interim step, a system of collective security that I'll come to. These are all interlinked with each other. So the pooling of all the sources of energy, oil, gas, nuclear, everything else in the hands of a supranational global authority, very similar to the European coal and steel community, which is our historical model for how to do this. It was very successful, by the way. Coal and steel in the aftermath of the Second World War was the equivalent of our oil, gas, and nuclear today. And we'll get to how these nations in Europe were willing to cede sovereignty over a critical economic sector upon which their entire economic well-being relied, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War. They were willing to cede sovereignty to the hands of the supranational authority that they didn't even get to elect, and to have it create rules that were then binding on them. And that they could use their courts, their courts could be used to enforce these rules that the supranational authority created. It's a fascinating story, and I've written about it at length. Later I can tell you where you can learn more about it. But one of the key features of this supranational authority needs to be that we weave into it a set of global ethics or shared principles that we also need to identify. We cannot just start building new institutions without ensuring that baked into them, into their structure and processes, a certain set of principles, starting with the law of oneness, right, that we talked about, to ensure that they won't go the way of our past institutions. Interestingly, a lot of current thinkers have started to arrive, and politicians and people who really have been involved in international affairs for decades have started to arrive at the same conclusion. They include people like the former foreign minister of Australia and former head of the International Crisis Group, Gareth Evans. They include Professor Ian Golden of Oxford University. They include Pascal Lamy, the former director of the WTO. So these are not just people whose heads are in the sky and who we can accuse of being pie in the sky. These are really hard-nosed, hardened politicians and people who have been involved in global affairs. And thank goodness that they're coming around to it as well. Kishore Mahbubani also, he was Singapore's representative on the Security Council for a number of years and president of the Security Council. He's also a very well-respected professor at the National University of Singapore. So we need to weave these in. I wanted to have pointed this out. What sorts of principles are we talking about? Principles of oneness, of justice and equity that lead us to understand, for instance, that if we want to ensure the advantage of one nation on the face of this planet, the only way to do it is by ensuring the advantage of the whole. So if the kidney wants to ensure that it is the healthiest it can be, its best bet is to ensure that the entire body is healthy and that we have a good diet and that the oxygen levels are good and the food is good and we're exercising and everything is clean and no other member of the body or organ is diseased. So that's how we maximize our well-being as nations in this interconnected organism. Equitable and equal treatment so that, for instance, we don't engage in discrimination. So if there's genocide in Africa, we treat it as seriously as we treat genocide in Europe, so that while we don't turn a blind eye to the genocides in Darfur and the DRC, where 8 to 10 million people died just during a few years of while King Leopold, Emperor Leopold reigned. And we talk a lot about the Holocaust in Germany, but nobody talks about the 8 to 10 million who died in DRC. That's a horrific number. And they died brutal, brutal, brutal deaths. And we won't turn a blind eye to the Rwandas and on and on and on, right? We're happy to go into Bosnia, we're happy to go into Kosovo, we're happy to go into Ukraine because they're in Europe. Well, we need to start treating all of these genocides on an equal footing and focusing on the collective versus the national good. So let's look at the Supranational Agency for a Global Authority for Regulating Energy. Let's look at some of the features that we end up having in this agency when we apply the set of global ethics. And we can talk later, and maybe this is a question some of you want to ask, you know, how do we arrive at a system of shared global ethics? We've done it before in the world, and I'm happy to share examples with you and to try to convince you and persuade you that it is not only possible, but it's been done before. But let's go back to our Supranational Global Authority. When you apply the law of oneness and of equity and justice alone, you end up with a bunch of things, which is exactly what happened with the European coal and steel community. First of all, you have democratic legitimacy. So I propose that in the system that we create, members of all national legislatures elect 2 individuals. And then once all the 193 nations have elected those elected, so 193 times 2, they elect from amongst themselves 19 members to serve for a period of time. The world can decide 3, 4, 5 years, whatever we deem appropriate. Secondly, these people who serve in the interests of humanity as a whole, because it's a supranational body, have autonomy both in their decision-making, so they do not seek or accept instructions from their national governments. Jean Monnet did this with the European Coal and Steel Commission, and it worked. He said, surely we can find a handful of human beings who are capable of rising above national interests and have the interests of these 6 member nations as a whole in mind. He also ensured their autonomy by ensuring autonomy of funding. So instead of national contributions, which is what we do with all our intergovernmental organizations, including the UN, which has caused such problem because those who contribute more feel like they should have a bigger say, namely the United States in particular, like we get to kind of boss other people around, tell them what to do, and understandably, there's a lot of resentment and pushback. So this way, there is no national contribution. The funding is done by taking a percentage of the proceeds from the sale of of the oil, gas, whatever, or the clean energy or the nuclear. Transparency, the supranational organization, because it has management and control of all these sources of energy, knows where stuff is being produced, how much, and more importantly, who needs what, when, on what timetable. One of the stunning things, even with oil and gas, is that there's not a very good transparent system of knowing what nations will need what amounts of energy when, and therefore we tend to lag behind in building kind of like LNG terminals or drilling. Even though we know we have reserves, we don't drill, and then all of a sudden we're caught by surprise, and then there isn't enough quantity, and so prices go up. I mean, it's just a crazy system. So we can do better. The power to invest in upgrade capabilities to meet demand, which is what I just talked about. Decision making. So right now, most decision making in international organizations is done by consensus, or where there's veto power in critical institutions like the Security Council. And it's basically hamstrung those bodies because the Security Council has not been able to discharge its main responsibility of maintaining peace in the world. So instead, we would act as a college for this institution for voting purposes. And as long as there's a quorum present, then a majority vote would be sufficient. We would need the power to enforce the rules. So again, unlike the Security Council and the UN General Assembly, which can just pass resolution after resolution with no standing force to actually enforce these, we would be able to enforce these rules using the courts of all the member nations, just as the European Coal and Steel Community did. In addition, the organization would have the power to enforce its rulings through fines and sanctions. There are a lot of other elements, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what happens when you first identify a set of primary principles and then apply them methodically in building out a new kind of institution, the likes of which we generally don't see. Again, for those of you who are skeptical, we know it's been done with the European Coal and Steel Community. I will just very quickly mention a second interim step that I think we should start taking, especially given our experiences with Syria and then Ukraine. We have to create a viable system of collective security for the world. So in short, I propose that leaders, starting with a handful of core leaders whom we trust and who are distinguished and have as their goal just peace, nothing else, gather and establish a commission to determine the amount of arms that each nation should be allowed to keep and maintain, just in order to maintain order within its borders. By the way, this was one of the points that was proposed by Woodrow Wilson as part of his 14 points before the League of Nations was created. FDR in the Atlantic Charter, which was the basis on which the United Nations was formed, also came back to this principle. We still haven't been able to incorporate it, but I think that given all the suffering that we've now seen, maybe humanity's ready to take the next step. Then the rest of the arms, so the difference between what each nation needs to maintain order within its borders and what it has needs to be destroyed under international supervision, and all nuclear arms must be destroyed in a phase-down fashion going simultaneously across the board. No one nation can be allowed to hold on to nuclear weapons. The risk is just too great that they'll be used accidentally, if not deliberately. Then we need to come to international agreement that if one nation arises to destroy the peace of the world, all the nations will arise to bring that government to heel using an international standing force. So that is another thing we need to create. We need to create an international standing force to which all nations contribute troops and equipment so that everybody has a vested interest, that is under the auspices of a global executive that, again, there's a lot of material here that would need to be restructured. So not the current Security Council, because it's not representative of all the nations of the world. There is no trust that it acts the way it should. The way they vote needs to be rehauled. And it has to be, this standing force has to function in accordance with predetermined rules that apply to everybody equally. Again, that principle of equity and justice, you treat everybody equally and even-handedly, and in service of justice. So what's interesting to me is that in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, we saw President Zelensky come and address the US Congress. And I don't know if you remember, in his address, he proposed the creation of a U-24, a United for Peace 24 standing force. I was very sad to see that the press did not pick up on this, because he explained what he thought this was about. This was not about Ukraine. This was a global force that would be created precisely in the spirit of nipping in the bud any disturbance of the peace, similar to what happened, the illegal invasion of Ukraine. So soon as that kind of act of aggression happens anywhere, or what happened in Syria with a leader starting to use chemical weapons against his own people, right? Then this force would step in within, the 24 stood for 24 hours, would be able to move within 24 hours to nip this thing in the bud. That is the kind of world towards which we need to move. I'm not here to say I support or don't support President Zelensky. I am not, I'm not engaged in partisan politics or taking sides, but when I hear an idea that sounds like it's a good idea for all of us, then I'm happy to embrace the idea, regardless of whose mouth it comes out of. And that is our ability to kind of gauge a truth for ourselves, right? We all have independent minds. So I think that particular idea is a brilliant one. The ultimate long-term goal towards which we're all driving with these interim steps is in the long term, and it's going to take time to get there. We want to create, I believe, a world federation of states, very similar to what we did in the United States, moving from a confederation of 13 loosely associated states to a federation. We unified and integrated because we realized that by doing so, we would be stronger and we wouldn't fall apart. This similarly at the global level, if we take those principles of federalism, we would create a global legislature that had the authority to pass binding legislation in certain narrow spheres where the collective interests of humanity are at stake and where the only solution is a collective one, like with climate change. We need a world executive backed by an international standing force, so that when we have breaches of the peace like we saw with Ukraine, the world can step in and take on its collective responsibility to protect, which is one of the principles we've signed on to, and now have an institution associated with that principle and capable of implementing it. And finally, a world court that is reformed, that has compulsory jurisdiction, which our current International Court of Justice in The Hague does not have, and as well as a capacity to have its judgments be binding and enforceable, which again, the current ICJ does not have any means to enforce. And again, we would use the international standing force. All right, I'm going to skip this next slide, which is, there's a whole nother topic. If you're interested in it, please pick up my book, The Alchemy of Peace. There is a component to this whole conversation, which is the learning to elect fit leaders, the importance of changing our concept of what we think of power and authority, and therefore the way we go about electing fit leaders. That's a whole nother topic we don't have time for tonight, but I just wanted to flag it. And ultimately, we're at the point now, folks, where we need to act with courage and creativity. Robert Schuman, who signed on to Jean Monnet's plan for the European coal and steel community, famously said this: world peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. I think that is a wonderful marching order for all of us. If you're interested in the material here, I commend to you this book, The Alchemy of Peace. It's available on Amazon, both in digital form and in soft copy. It's about 6 essential shifts in mindsets and habits to achieve world peace. If you just want to know about the whole, how the European coal and steel community functioned and how we can use it as a model to tackle the 3 challenges that I talked about, you can look at Bridge to Global Governance, Tackling Climate Change, Nuclear Proliferation, and Energy Distribution, also available on Amazon. And if you just are interested in the final model, which is a world federation, and how, and kind of, if you want to know, be convinced that creating such an ultimate model will actually solve any one of our given global challenges. In that book, which is short, you can read in 45 minutes, I take a whole bunch of these global challenges and demonstrate how having such a global supranational federation would actually resolve these crises. So I thank you very much for your attention and patience, and I look forward to engaging with you. So I'm now going to stop sharing. And then I will look to Janine to.
Great. Thank you so much, Sovaida. So I was actually going to ask you to plug some of your books, so now I don't have to ask you that question. So thank you very much for that. So I was flipping through pictures of people on the chat today, and I noticed that we had a lot of younger listeners, which is always exciting for me. So I'm going to ask the first question to give our viewers time to put a question in the chat. So I was very fortunate that Upper Hudson Peace Action contacted me to join, but I know other people aren't as lucky, and a lot of them don't know how to start. So other than Peace Action, do you have organizations that you can recommend for people? Or if they're not comfortable joining an organization, do you have first steps as an individual so that we can create the supernatural system?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So I agree with you, Janine. I believe that we will get to where we need to be through grassroots action. And so that means raising consciousness at the individual level. There are a bunch of organizations that do good work. So Citizens for Global Solutions, on which Larry and I both serve on the board. The young, for those of you who are younger, there is a wonderful association, the Young World Federalists, YWF. There's another organization, the World Federalist Movement, that is an umbrella organization for a lot of us organizations. So what we're trying to do is each of us has started our own organization, and each of these is doing wonderful work. And, you know, it's as it should be, because I think in our own localities and nations and so on, I think it's very important to do whatever you can do. Don't even wait. You don't even need to join an organization. So here's what I would say to you. There's a lot of material on the internet. There are a lot of good podcasts, for instance. I have a podcast called Reimagining Our World. I go live once a month on Facebook and on YouTube. It's on the YouTube channel. It's called Reimagining Our World. There are other podcasts out there. There's the People Powered Planet podcast. And there are just a whole, so podcasts, young people love podcasts. So that's a really great way to go. Start listening to podcasts, share them with your friends, get on social media. When you get together with your friends, instead of just discussing, you know, the current, whatever it is you guys discuss these days. I'm not young anymore, so I have a 22-year-old, so I should know some of the stuff that young folks talk about. But, you know, have meaningful conversations, basically, about things that will help make the world a better place. And start having, actually, one thing we do here in DC is groups of us have what we call meaningful conversations. And we use Meetup, we use Facebook, we use, you know, various ways of getting the word out. And we tell people we're going to gather together on this day, either on Zoom or in person. And we just sit and we have these conversations where we raise our collective consciousness. So you don't have to do anything big and grand. Invite 2 of your neighbors over for coffee and have a meaningful conversation and say, hey, the way our world is not sustainable. We need to do something. What can we do? Are you aware that there are these ideas for creating? So that's how you start. First, we need to get enough people at the grassroots on board. Once we're on board, we will elect the kind of leaders who will take us to where we need to be, because they're in the decision-making chairs, right? But right now, we're not conscious enough to elect the kind of leaders we need. That's why that topic is actually such an important topic. And that's why I devoted a whole segment of the alchemy of peace to that, because it's actually a critical piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Anyway, I hope that helped. And please feel free to reach out to me if you want to collaborate at cpgg.org. I'll just stick it in the chat, and then and if you go there, you'll see my contact information.
So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I wrote down act creative and I circled it. So I can only think of one creative thing that people are doing right now, and that's targeting museums for climate change. Have you noticed any other creative acts that people are doing?
How about we hear from the audience? Have any of you heard of creative things that people are doing? Well, again, I can tell you about our neighborhood here. So I live in Washington, D.C. I live in a particular part of the city. And we decided to have a conference, we called it a conference, it was a get together at a local cafe. So it's my favorite cafe. We love to go and sit outside, especially during the pandemic. We got used to sitting outside. So we invited 30 of our friends to get together, and the theme of the conference was building a better world. Okay, who doesn't want to build a better world? So if you pitch something that everybody can sign on to, people came from all different, it was a very diverse group. So ethnically diverse, racially diverse, people from different walks of life, had different jobs, you know, from trainers to somebody who runs a school for young children in China, and on and on and on. Just and we had a conversation, including a conversation on needing a new system of global governance. So that is one creative thing that is being done. And by the way, people did this all around the world. There was a whole group of people that was active doing this. We had 8 of these just in DC, and one of them happened to be in our neighborhood.
We have an interesting conversation going on in the chat that I would like you to join if you don't mind. Sally had asked if each of the 193 countries has equal vote, and some countries have much larger populations, is that democratic?
Yeah. No, obviously we need to come up again. I think if you look at the experience of the United States, you'll get a good idea. Remember how much time the founding fathers spent at the Constitutional Convention about, you know, what would be a fair distribution of votes, and we have a bicameral system, and our senators are elected one way to make sure that the smaller states feel like they have an equal say, but then our House of Representatives is elected based on population of states. And so these are things that will need to be sorted out. There are a lot of people have done a lot of thinking on this issue, and there are a bunch of proposals out there. There are actually tomes that have been written. I think I'm not so interested right now in getting into the weeds, but it's important. It has to be fair, right? So you can't have a country of 1 billion people having one vote, and then a nation with, I don't know, 100,000 people having an equal vote. That just makes no sense. So we need to have weighted voting and all kinds of voting, but we can figure that out. The first step, though, is to convince people that we need it and why. This is the thing that I have discovered in all the work that I do, including my work as a coach, is that if you want to motivate people to do something, you have to focus on the why. Once people are sold on the why, the hows become very easy. Most of us start in life by asking how, and then we feel overwhelmed because we can't figure out the how. But what's fascinating is once you get energized by the why, The how becomes it's just a strategy. And through the process of consultation, which is a key, remember I said cooperate, collaborate, and consult. This has to be something that has to be done as a result of consultation between all the member nations. You and I can't decide for them what they're going to do. We can propose ideas, as Jean Monnet did, but ultimately for people to have buy-in, they have to feel like they were part of the conversation.
So this question is long and I'm happy to repeat it. Please let me know if you need me to. As intermediate institutional stages toward, that's right, sorry. As intermediate institutional stages towards global democratic governance, what roles could be played by regional federations like the EU on one hand and global civil society on the other?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So actually in 2008, I wrote about this. At the time, what I was advocating for, particularly with respect to a system of collective security, was that we start by encouraging those regions of the world that do not have economic regional organizations to form one. Because one of the things I noticed is that when we have a regional economic organization and states start to collaborate with each other to better their lives economically, at some, like the European Economic Community that then became the European Union, at some point they're so successful that they become very vested in ensuring that this system doesn't fall apart, which means that they're interested in maintaining their own security as a regional unit. And that's when they start thinking about setting up a regional security organization. Now, the EU has had this conversation, and the EU is a little more complicated because many of the nations are part of NATO as well. So they've felt like they're under an umbrella already. But they've been having this conversation for many years and were very embarrassed when Kosovo happened in their own backyard, that they didn't have the regional capability to send their own troops in and deal with the problem, and that they needed to rely on the United States. They're still in the process of setting up a regional security organization. The African Union is another great example. It started with an economic entity, and they now have a standing force of their own. And it's been actually successful in thwarting or stopping things from escalating in some instances into full-blown war. So it has a wonderful deterrent effect. I think we should start creating others. I think the Middle East, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, they've been talking about it for a number of years, but they haven't set up a regional security organization. Southeast Asia could do with one, and on and on. And then once we create these regional economic organizations and security organizations, then eventually there's a whole ladder system that we can use to make them first units that become that are governed by their regions, but are still start coordinating with the Security Council. And eventually the idea is that all of these will be merged and become separate standing units within their regions of a supranational standing force, but they'll be stationed in their regions so that when something flares up, they'll be closer to the action. But if that regional unit can't deal with it, then the Security Council can call on other regional units to step in. So yes, I think there is a whole way that we can do this, and it may be more politically palatable for countries and regions, people more comfortable when they have common languages and culture and so on. And when their own backyard is at stake, they're probably more willing to cooperate. Civil society, absolutely. Civil society has an amazingly important role to play. I am a little, while civil society has a very important role to play, I also want to highlight something that has concerned me for a number of years that I'm just going to put out there. It's just being frankly sharing my concern. Just as lobbying is unfair because you get a small group of private interests get to have get the ears of decision makers in a way that I believe is completely unfair, because you don't get a balance of what everybody's needs are. The same can apply if we're not careful with civil society organizations. So I've seen civil society organizations who have a disproportionate influence, even though we're all self-appointed. Nobody elected us, right? Anybody can start a nonprofit organization and a civil society organization. And while we can do a lot of wonderful good, in other words, hear the grassroots voices and funnel them to the decision makers, we have yet to come up with a system where this is done completely equitably, right? So that everybody gets an equal chance. And I see this happen all the time. And I see like people who serve in civil society organizations who already had relationships with muckety mucks in power, and they're doing backdoor conversations. And even in fora that are supposed to be for all of civil society, they get the ear of the decision maker and the rest don't. And so we just have to be very aware that this stuff goes on, and we need to work with each other to make sure that everybody is given an equal opportunity. So yeah.
A really great point. And I know that a lot of people can feel burnout after doing this for so long. What can you talk about staying, positive and staying inspired to keep on doing this?
So
I know I felt burnt out.
Yeah. So first of all, is recognizing that you can't deal with the problems of the whole world single-handedly. I have to remind myself every morning that I'm just a drop. And the goal is, remember we talked about the imaginal discs that need to proliferate for this butterfly to be born. So I am just one. So first of all, it's very humbling. And when you approach things from a space of humility, which is very hard in today's world, and by the way, that's another one of the banes of civil society organizations. It's one of the reasons I chose as a lawyer for my 20 years of practice not to work for a nonprofit, because I dabbled in nonprofits and I didn't like them because people were very turf oriented. They didn't get money, but boy, were egos vested. This was my idea. This is my turf, and that's the kind of stuff that can lead to burnout. I do a lot of coaching of people, and it's the space you're coming from mentally and emotionally that contributes to burnout. But if we keep things in perspective and recognize I am just one person, it's my responsibility to do my best. What can I do to bring as many people on board, but what's sustainable? So again, start locally. I find that engaging at the local level is wonderful. So I'll just give you an example. So lately, through Citizens for Global Solutions and working in conjunction with the World Service Authority and a Center for Peace and Global Governance, we started a pilot project that actually started 2 nights ago, where we went into a local university. It's an undergraduate university for low-income women of color, especially. And we've started a pilot project teaching, sharing these ideas on global governance. And actually our first discussion was on global ethics and the need for identifying and agreeing upon a system of global ethics. We had 7 students. It was an absolutely phenomenal evening, right? I was just soaring on cloud 9 because these students were so wonderful, so engaged, so passionate. And that's all I needed. I didn't need to have 200 people. I have spoken to groups of 200, but you just keep going. You just do. When opportunities come, you take them. If opportunities don't come, you create them, and you create them locally. And eventually other opportunities will come. Things grow out.
This is a really great question. It's a small question, but it's a great question nonetheless. With this system, and I think our questioner means the supranational system. So with the supranational system, how would it change racism in the world?
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Guys want to solve all of it. Yes, say racism. Well, let's start with this country before we get to the world. I believe it's one of the most challenging issues that we face. So this is based on my own belief system now. I believe that the first step before we can address so many of these social ills that we have, and there are many of them. Racism is one big one. Gender discrimination is another big one. Religious fanaticism and the fight between religions is another huge one, not only in this country, but globally. But I think the first step is to put an end to war. So much of our energy right now goes into destruction, so much of our money. So energy on all fronts, human resources, financial resources. We need to stop that and then take that money. So right now, every year we're spending over $2 trillion on the military industrial complex. We need to stop that and start diverting that energy into creating and building up systems, social systems, addressing, anti-Black racism, the infrastructure, the institutionalized racism, the healthcare problems, the education problems, the housing problems. But, we keep telling ourselves we don't have money, and yet Congress just passed a bill, when was it, 3 weeks ago, saying that we would start funding $865 billion a year to Ukraine, just to one country. $865 billion. This is crazy. Just doesn't make any sense, right? The whole world needs to come together to put an end to this scourge of war. Once we've done that, then we will have some breathing space to tackle these key problems. And these are basically, again, based on need mindset shifts. Once we understand this law of oneness that I talked about, when we truly understand that you and I are, I believe, spiritual beings having a physical experience, and that the color of my skin or my gender are a zero, they're neither plus or minus, they just are conducive to the beauty of the diversity of the human race, and that's all. And we get to a point from just tolerating each other to celebrating our differences as we would different flowers in a garden, as opposed to insisting that they all be the same height and shape and color and fragrance. Then we're talking. Then, as they say, we're cooking with gas. And that's when we start to be able to more easily overcome problems of racism, because it's based on a deep understanding of who we are as human beings. What does it mean when we say we're one body that is interconnected? If I say that the Black members or the Asian members of this body are, they're less than, wow. It's based on pure ignorance of the reality of our social existence, right? And I end up suffering as a result. It's not just going to bite the person I'm discriminating against. It bites me and makes me a lesser person. And so this is a very involved and long question.
What steps could be taken by us in the US to get the US, which has a culture of exceptionalism and enjoys its role as sole superpower, towards acting less nationalistically?
How is it going to happen? I think it's going to come once we've suffered enough. The question is, what are we going to deem enough? At some point, I firmly believe, again, for me, looking at history, I think this is where we're going to go. When I look at the European Union and how the European coal and steel community came out of the embers of the Second World War, I had hoped, honestly, that COVID would get us a part of the way there. I'm just one individual, and I'm sharing with you my individual thoughts. It's become clear to me that we're going to need to suffer a lot more. I think, given the degree of proliferation of arms in the world, the degree of disunity between the nations of the world, especially large nations, I very much fear that we are going to have another world war, if not now, a few years from now, and likely a nuclear one unless we really pull back rapidly from the brink. We've gotten too complacent. I don't know why we think we can amass arms and that we aren't going to use them. The more you amass arms, the chances of using them just goes up. And it doesn't take, when you study some of the near misses we've had, like with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the crisis we had in the 50s over Taiwan, we came this close to all-out nuclear war. And it happened all by accident. Nobody intended for it to happen. What ends up happening is a series of missteps that people on both sides make, because they don't really understand each other's mentality. They miscalculate. They make decisions without properly communicating. And all it takes is a moment even of anger if it's going to be deliberate. And that's it. Once the flare has been set, the thing has been ignited, then, as I said, even limited nuclear war, we looked at that, could result in 2 billion people starving, not to mention all the other death, destruction, and maiming that will happen as a result. So, yeah, I think suffering, we're going to get there. But we have choice. We can say, okay, we've suffered enough now, right? So
this is a very long paragraph that has 3 questions in it. So we're just going to take it at a question at a time, not to overload you. And so it starts with political versus economic development. When groups come together to combat the idea of world peace, are we barred by our own views in terms of development due to politics versus actual change that can help build stronger nations that can efficiently partner as single as well as team player to better enhance living, work, and conditions? Do you need me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Sure. When groups come together to combat the idea of world peace, are we barred by our own views in terms of development due to politics versus actual change that can help build stronger nations that can efficiently partner as single as well as team player to better enhance living?
Okay, whoever wrote that question is very complicated, but if I've understood what I'm going to share with you based on my understanding, so forgive me if I'm wrong. So if we're going to come together to work, yes, of course, our mindsets are going to get in the way, and also certain habits. So for instance, let's just take this country. The degree of polarization that exists within our country itself right now makes us far more ineffective. If we want to be an effective team player at the global level, to be able to bring along other nations to work with us to create a global supranational system to make peace in the world, we need to get our own act together. We need to clean up our own backyard. And that means overcoming polarization. Now, again, I have a whole chapter on this in The Alchemy of Peace, because it's a very critical question. You know, I think I'll just share an analogy and stop there. And then if you're interested, you're welcome to go read. For any of you who've either known somebody, or if you yourselves have had an autoimmune disease, you will have learned from your doctor that once you have one autoimmune disease, the chance of getting another one goes up tremendously. And in fact, a lot of people, they come in clusters. So if you have multiple sclerosis, you're likely to also get at some point lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or vice versa, and on and on and on. And they now view type 2 onset diabetes as an autoimmune disease as well. So very fascinating. And what ends up happening is these diseases are really symptoms of a deeper problem to do with inflammation that's gone rampant in the body, that's out of control. Our disunity in the world and in our country is the root cause of a lot of problems that we see. It is the root cause of racial problems, the political polarization, the tribalism, you name it. And we need to really understand that if we're going to be strong and a healthy body, just as a nation, so if we're one organ of the world body, we need to make sure we as an organ are healthy. And so it behooves us to do what it takes to unify ourselves. It's okay to have different viewpoints, but if we are going to denigrate each other because we have different views, then there's something terribly wrong with that picture. Honestly, it's a sign of insecurity to want to denigrate somebody else just because we happen to have different views. And we need to learn to hone the capacity to consult. So again, I want to offer a view of consultation. So to me, consultation is a tangible expression of the principle of justice. Remember, we said one of the global ethics we need to embrace is equity and justice. So consulting means when you, I, and several other people come and we look at, say, a gem, and I look at it from one angle and I see red, and you look at it in the way the light hits it, you see blue, and another person sees yellow. We could do one of two things. We could argue with each other and say, no, I'm right. I see red and it's only red. And you do the same, and then we end up in conflict. Or we could raise our collective understanding by being able to stand in each other's shoes and look at things from each other's vantage points and say, wow, isn't this amazing? This gem actually has all these different facets to it. And now what can we do? So this principle of consultation, which means really the ability to detach our egos from our viewpoints, is a really important skill that I think we need to start teaching in schools. You know, George Washington, our first president, warned us against the polarization that would ensue from having political parties. So remember, I said we need to radically reconceptualize society. I think one of the things we need to start reconceptualizing is getting rid of political parties, because they're not interested in the collective good. Most people are just interested in rah, 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 my sports team, my party. As long as my party wins, we're good to go. But without stepping back and saying, is this actually serving the interests of the United States of America? Because my health depends on the health of everybody else around me. And I don't just mean physical health. I mean, you know, the way I behave. So again, these are all intertwined, complicated conversations. And the person who wrote this question clearly can see that everything is interconnected. Yeah.
You actually answered his other two questions in your response, which was perfect. So now I don't have to ask those questions to you. It's about 8:25 right now. So I just want to thank you for giving your talk. And I want to end with a comment that Douglas Klein wrote that I think is very beautiful. We all need to understand that nobody wins in a nuclear war. I think that's a great way to end the conversation tonight.
Yep. No kidding. And we need to have this conversation to let people know, because I don't think a lot of people don't actually understand. They think, again, if it happens over there, if it happens in India and Pakistan, if it happens over Kashmir, if it happens over Taiwan, it's far away enough, you know, that's okay, we'll be okay. People are always shocked when I give them the statistics about how many billion will die and how it will affect the global economy. These are really all fascinating studies that have been done by experts. And, you know, 10 years, no summer around the world, really? I mean, I don't think people really think about what it means. So.
I agree 100%. And I think everybody in the chat and everybody on the call will agree with that 100%. Well, this was wonderful. I want to thank you on behalf of our Hudson Peace Action for joining us this evening. I want to thank everybody who participated. We got to just about all of the questions, which is wonderful and doesn't always happen. So that is great. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and say